much for joining us this morning for this virtual event, a thought leadership webinar that will be hosted by the Alumni Ghana chapter in association with the Chartered Insurance Institute of Ghana and the Institute of Futures Research. Welcome everybody, settle yourselves in nicely, grab that last bit of coffee. We are just waiting for a couple of more people to join us this morning. Maybe some have technical issues to log in, so we just give them a couple of minutes time. In the meantime, while we wait, I might just share with you, you may use your video if you are comfortable, and of course, if your bandwidth allows. Sometimes it is a bit difficult with a video, but our speakers love to see you throughout, especially towards the end for the questions. You may want to keep it up off during the event, but during the question time, you're welcome to switch on your video. Please try and keep your microphone on mute throughout the event. And we invite you to raise your questions in the chat box throughout the event. And of course, during the question and answer slot, you can just raise your hand too on the platform. So put your questions in the chat. It's an interactive session. Our speakers love to engage on your questions throughout. So put your questions in there and our facilitator and us will pick it up and ensure that gets addressed. Very warm welcome to all our USB alumni, our students who are joining us this morning, staff members of the USB and USB Ed, our friends of the USB across Africa. I had a look at the registrations this morning and I see many of our participants this morning are from Ghana, from Nigeria, we have from Swaziland, Namibia, and we have from Canada and Europe. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Of course, our South African alumni and students and friends are also on the registration platform. We just hope they can join us as we go along. A quick, just a quick overview again in the event, Insurance and Prosilience, Reinventing the New Normal. This event was initiated by the USB Alumni Ghana chapter in association with the Chartered Insurance Institute of Ghana and the Institute of Futures Research. So our program for this morning, I will shortly be handing you over to the chairperson of the Ghana Alumni chapter, Dr. Geraldine Abaidu, resides in Accra, Ghana, and she will handle the introduction to, first of all, the president of the Chartered Insurance Institute of Ghana, Mr. Tawia Ben Ahmed. I believe he is still having issues of joining in, but after his brief overview of the Institute, she will then introduce Dr. Morne Mostert, the director of the Institute of Futures Research at USB, and who will then take us through the program until we do questions and comments. And of course, throughout, you can raise your questions in the chat. Following this, at the end, at 1 o'clock, after our formal presentations, there will be an opportunity for anybody to ask questions on how to apply for any program at the USB, one of our academic programs, or one of our business courses with USB Ed. So we will have representatives available at 1 o'clock to answer any of your questions on that. So bear that in mind at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, I will be handing over then to Dr. Geraldine Abaidu, who is also the Vice President of the Chartered Insurance Institute of Ghana. And she will be introducing the President, Mr. Tawia Ben Ahmed, to start off with, and extend also a warm welcome to all our participants this morning. thank you very much again for joining us, for supporting the Thought Leadership webinars. Thank you to Futures Research Institute to also support us on that. And with that, I would like to hand you over to Dr. Geraldine. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Thank you so much, Christelle. I'm so excited this morning to be here. Before then, I'm getting a few WhatsApp messages. People are still at the waiting room asking whether they can be let in. So Lizelle, if you can help us with that. Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. Good morning, esteemed members of the insurance industry of Ghana. Good morning to the fellows and members of the Chartered Insurance Institute of Ghana, alumni of the University of Stellenbosch, students of Stellenbosch University, friends and family, and of course the alumni members in Nigeria, Kenya, Botswana. I know a few of you are on with us in this program. Thank you so much for your participation for this program. Insurance industry realized that we need a bit of prosilience, because we've been talking about resilience. And when the topic came out, a lot of people were asking, I mean, it's a new word, but I think at the end of the day, we'll be able to appreciate why we chose this topic. Insurance and prosilience, reinventing the new normal. And of course, this has been possible because of the collaboration established between Chartered Insurance Institute of Ghana and USB Alumni Office. Thank you so much, Christelle and the USB team for making this happen at exciting times. And I believe that it's not just a one-off engagement. We're going to have series where we'll be able to share ideas and impact our lives. We are going to have a very insightful engagement that will set us thinking on the future strategies and operational decisions for growth, sustainability, and impact in the spaces that we operate. I hope you all learn a thing or two to aid us in our corporate and individual journeys. And we are privileged to have the president of the CIG with us, Mr. Tewia Ahmed. He is the CEO, Managing Director for Metropolitan Ghana. And I know Metropolitan is also in South Africa. The collaboration is really strong. So on this note, I would want to welcome Mr. Tewia Ahmed, if you are here with us, to share your view on the CIG. Then we take it from here. Thank you so much for having you all. Mr. Tewia Ahmed.
Hi, thank you very much, Geraldine. Sorry, this is not Mr. Tewia Ahmed, this is David Avo, the Secretary of CIG. Sorry, I have to come in for Mr. Tewia Ben Ahmed at this moment because he just had an emergency that prevented him from logging on. So on his behalf and on behalf of the Council of the CIG, I want to welcome all participants, especially those of the CIG, for joining us in today's seminar. It promises to be a very insightful one. And today, the stage is for our speaker to share all the wealth of knowledge he has garnered over the years with us. So on behalf of the president and on behalf of Council, I just want to welcome all of us to this webinar. Let's relax, take notes, and also prepare to ask questions. Let's have a robust discussion. Thank you all very much and all the best.
Thank you so much, David, for that very impressive introduction of the CIG. We'll move on to the speaker for the day. A very exciting moment at this time. And Dr. Mostert had been my lecturer. I always say that he taught me systems thinking. And believe you me, that's about 12, 11 years ago. And from that time, anything I do, I think about systems. Even when I'm washing, any decision I take, the first thing that comes to mind is, what will this be part of? And I try to link the systems to make sure that there's effectiveness, there's efficiency, and everything is in sync. Thank you, Dr. Mostert, for dropping that nugget into my spirit. Dr. Mostert is the director of the Institute of Futures Research at the Stellenbosch University. He advises globally on future-based executive decision-making, strategy, and intellectual development for senior leaders, and has worked in London, Paris, Rome, Geneva, and several other countries. Subsequent to his PhD in the management of technology and innovation, his areas of specialization include future thinking, strategic thinking, systems thinking, and creative innovation. He is a regular keynote speaker and frequent guest on radio and television in the business media. He is the author of the influential book Systems Leadership Learning, Leadership Development in the Era of Complexity, which has been the prescribed text for several international programs on strategic leadership. He is a member of the ILO International Panel of Experts on the Future Works. And for the insurance industry, he has been here also. He worked with Discovery, and then he is the founder, co-founder of Black African Insurance Association. I hope I got it right. Dr. Mostert, you are welcome, and thank you for accepting to do this with us. You have our attention now. Thank you so much.
Dr. Badi, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, those lovely words. It is encouraging that someone in that class was listening to me, Geraldine. Thank you. I
did.
The word of support. To the CIIG and to USB Alumni, thank you so much for this lovely invitation. It really is a great honor to share one's work with colleagues. And that's indeed what we'll do this morning. And you've heard that my work is in future thinking, systems thinking, strategic thinking, and creative thinking. So in the thinking domain, that's mainly because thinking is a lot easier than actually doing any work. I spend my life essentially thinking, and if I'm not doing that, then I'm thinking about thinking. And that's a little bit of what we'll do over the next hour or so. What I'll share is a model that's emerged over the last 2 years or so, accelerated really by the COVID experience that we've all had. And I'll do that not purely in an academic sense, but really in what one might call an institute sense. I direct, as you heard, the Institute for Futures Research at the USB. We were the first such institute, just for interest, and remain the only formal institute for the study of the future on the African continent at an academic institution. And as an institute, we really have sort of one leg in the academic world and the other leg in industry, in organizations. And it is with that lens that I'll present some thoughts this morning. I'm very curious to hear from you where you think the model that I'll be sharing may be of value and how it may help organizations to, in fact, navigate their own futures. So what we'll do is I'll present some thoughts, and then we'll have a break kind of halfway through to get some comments, and then I'll present the balance of the thinking. I will give you some background in terms of where the ideas came from. I think that's an important perspective. So the title then, as you heard from Geraldine, an attempt to coin a new phrase, prosilience, moving away deliberately from the idea of resilience, and I'll make my argument as we go along. And the subtitle there, pro-inventing the recovery model for times of crisis. How can we think anew about a model of recovery in a time of crisis? I'm encouraged as I embark on sharing these ideas with you by the words of Myron Rogers, who said the process you use to get to the future is the future that you get. In other words, your future is essentially in the method. The implications of this is significant because if your methods are flawed, by implications, then Rogers argues that your future will be equally flawed. So that's why it's really quite essential to think about the method, the formal structured process that you might use to conceive of and advance towards your own future. Now, in the work that we do, it is very imaginative, very creative work, but we often have this kind of dilemma, and it's worthwhile saying that right at the offset here. We often get clients, and by the way, most of our work is with clients, with formal business and government engagements, although there is a postgraduate program also in futures. We get this kind of dilemma. If we give clients something new, then they say, well, that's foreign. I've never heard of that in my life. But if we give them something that's not new, then they say, well, I've already heard about that. That's outdated. So if it's foreign, they also say, well, that's not local. And if it is local, then they say, well, that's not international. So such is the dilemma of the world of an advisor in the field of future studies and strategy. In other words, what clients often want is, we want something that is completely new, which confirms exactly what we are already doing, and that recognizes our complete uniqueness and is benchmarked against all the others who are doing exactly what we're already doing. So it's an obvious conundrum. If it's new, it's foreign. If it's not new, it's outdated. If it's foreign, it's not local. But if it is local, well, then it's not international. So we'll try and overcome some of these dilemmas as we move our way through the process. Okay. We know that a natural response to a crisis is what Lewin referred to as a freeze, a simple freeze. It's a natural psychological reaction to a threat. It's a typical threat response. I freeze, I lock the doors, I bring down the cages, batten down the hatches, as they used to say in the British Navy. I protect myself. And that kind of response to a crisis is not necessarily wrong if it is a short-term crisis. So if you can think about, I'm a caveman and there's a saber at the cave door, well, then I can kind of roll a rock in front of the door in the hope that the saber will pass along and move along and the threat will disappear. What we've learned, obviously, from COVID is that this is not a short-term crisis. It's a longer-term crisis. And so the freeze response is really inappropriate, because what the freeze response does is it tries to pretend that you can somehow hold the world. And then when the threat passes, you can return to something called normal. You can return to what might be referred to as back to normal. And we hear that from clients all the time. When are we going back to normal? Well, from our perspective, the bad news is we are never going back to normal. There will not be such a time. But you shouldn't take that personally, because never in the 350,000-year history of humanity has there been an example of where we have gone back to normal. What we tend to do is we reinvent the normal as we go along. The good news is that this is not the new normal either. We are still inventing the new normal. So you can see that the freeze response really blinds us to the emerging realities of a new normal, and they are emerging, certainly not fixed yet. And of course, that freeze response has financial implications. And for the insurance industry, it's had enormous implications. And the industry is really, I think, in a process of revisiting how they think about risk and how they think about guarantees and what is an acceptable risk to carry. And so this is not just a conceptual notion. Of course, it has some very, very serious financial implications also. So if we start with definitions, the way that academics like to start, in the preparation of this work, I really tried to kind of go right back to, not in a time sense, but in a definitional sense, when we say we're in a crisis, well, what do we actually mean by that? And it's perhaps worth just highlighting one or two notions there. The first idea that I'd like to highlight is that it is sudden, very often surprising event. In other words, we didn't see it coming. So there was a lot of talk about the risk of global epidemics even before the crisis, but of course most of us didn't pay attention to that. And so we experience it as something that is sudden and surprising. In addition to the surprise, it is a significant interruption. A crisis is not just something that is overcome in a day or two. It is significant, and that significance plays out in the notion that it disturbs the systemic balance, the interconnectedness between things. The whole apple cart and the other carts for the other fruit and vegetables is also upset. And then it presents an appreciable threat. So it's not only a significant interruption, but the level of the threat is significant. And the threat, in the case of a crisis, doesn't go away the moment the crisis has hit. In fact, the moment it hits, the threat level goes up. In other words, the anticipated loss, as insurance people might sometimes refer to it, is increased. And that's particularly true in the world of future studies for something that we call the current future. By the current future, we simply mean if we keep going the way we're going right now, what's the future that we are producing? So let's imagine, let's do a little thought experiment, and we tried to do that before COVID. We asked the question about our current future. If we keep going the way we're going now, where are we going to end up? Well, a crisis, as we can see, really upsets the idea of what we think the current future is, and in fact redefines it. So most clients that we talk to now, of course, have a completely different view of what they think their current future might be. Of course, the real question is, how closely comparable are the current future and your preferred future? In other words, if you think about what's going to play out, if you just keep going the way you're going now, and you call that your current future, and you compare that with what you'd like the future to be, your preferred future, how closely are these two futures? And therein you can see why in our science we often refer to, or typically in fact refer to, futures studies in the multiple, because more than one future is always possible. And you can see how that opens the gap for yet more crises. So I think it is important just to point out that we are in what you might call an age of disruption. This is not kind of popular futures where I'm trying to tell you that the robots are coming and they're taking all your jobs and your life will never be the same again. This is a scientific review, and we can quite objectively argue that over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen an increase in the frequency of disruptive events, and we have also seen an increase in the severity of disruptive events. And of course, climate change is one salient example. So both the number of these disruptions is going up, and when they do occur, the severity of the disruptions is also going up. And this really does present us with a whitewater era, an era of immense disruption. So turns out your aunt was right all along. The world did used to be simpler. It is a lot more complex. It is so complex that it presents what we sometimes call in complexity theory a mess, a deep, interconnected, interwoven set of dilemmas. And unfortunately, traditional strategists are still working with clients a little bit like this. But despite the enormous complexity of the context, there is still this hanging on to a simplistic view that we can simply move from A to B. But as you can see, the moment you open the box, the moment you look at the context, you notice this pervasive disruption characterized by the frequency and severity increases that I've described. Okay, so the model that I'm going to present to you based on this idea of prosilience, just in terms of the provenance, for those of you really concerned with the background of the idea, it first appeared in a publication by the International Labour Organization. This is in 2017, and they kindly published my thoughts on prosilience as it relates to the future of work, and particularly the future of skills. And then it's been picked up in a number of places, including in the financial media, which I thought was really interesting for insurance folks as part of the financial services industry. Here it appears in Fin24. Now, I don't know when the last time was that you saw such a conceptual notion published by the financial media, but it tells you about the kind of time that we're in, and you can see the heading there. It says futurist COVID. Pre-COVID South Africa wasn't working, so why look back instead of ahead? And they feature that notion of prosilience in that article. And there have been you know, a number of occasions where I've had the opportunity to share this work beyond that first ILO appearance of the notion of prosilience with some colleagues, but also at a number of conferences. Pleased to have shared it with a few clients, and it's been applied in various fields and contexts. Most recently, in this publication, this is the Business Guide to Quality Healthcare. You can see very recent, just came out only a few weeks ago, and they dedicated 4 pages in an interview about the prosilience model that I'm going to share. So as we now get a little bit closer to the model, the conceptual landscape as the kind of background to what I'm going to share really is vast. I should point out that as futurists, our kind of default approach is to be transdisciplinary in nature. That means certainly not single discipline, more than one discipline, but not just the combination of various disciplines, the interrelatedness between various disciplines. And here are just some of the key concepts used in the approach in constructing a model like this. Systems thinking, of course, you heard from Geraldine, something I really love. Futures thinking, the world I'm in. I looked also at biophilic ideas, in other words, models that we can learn from nature. Of course, innovation, sustainability, the evolution of systems played a role. You can hear complexity science there, the role of leaders, how things shift in terms of a change theory, but also in terms of broad mega shifts. And so I looked at how people recover in terms of trauma, both psychological trauma, but also sports injury trauma, how people recover from addiction, from all sorts of injuries, and indeed, as I said, in biophilic terms, how nature might recover. So this is the hard work kind of behind the scenes to think about other recovery models and to see if we can produce a model for organizations, for business people, for senior leaders in the private and also the public sector that could guide them through their thinking as they conceive of a model of recovery for their own organizations. So perhaps at that point, Christelle, I wonder if we shouldn't, at this point, do a poll of some of our attendees and ask them, this question. Thanks so much, Christelle. So if you're joining us in the audience today, here's what I'd like you to reflect on. I want you to think about how clear is your organization's model for recovery. So if I asked you to draw a diagram or a picture or give me the key concepts of the recovery model that your organization particularly is using, and I don't mean do you know it because you might be the CEO, I mean, how clear do you think it is if I just walk to anyone in the organization, I ask them, okay, give us your recovery model here. What do you think people would say? Would you think it would be unclear, bit murky, quite clear, or crystal clear? What would you say? What did you say? You can see the scores developing there. Let me just give you a moment to think about it. Those delegates who have left to go and get a glass of morning wine, if you're just arriving, we're doing a poll. We're asking, how clear is your organization's model for recovery? Is it unclear? We're just in survival mode, just trying to hang on for dear life, hope for the best? Is it murky? Perhaps you have a sense of revised targets generally, and a few people have been furloughed, and some people are a bit unsure about whether they'll lose their jobs or not. Perhaps it's quite clear, you have a plan, you know, maybe there's even a spreadsheet, a Gantt chart, or is it crystal clear? Everybody knows what's going on, everybody knows how we're going to tackle this thing. Okay, let's give it 30 seconds and then we'll start. We still have some people voting or changing their minds. Okay, very good. Well, isn't that massively impressive? We have a rather large percentage of the audience who feel that it's really quite clear how their organization is going to recover from the dark and murky waters they find themselves in at the moment. 24%, that's roughly 1 in 4 of our respondents feel that it's a bit murky. They have a sense of where it might be going, but it's not really all that clear. Roughly 1 in 5 feel it's really unclear, no real sense. And then we have 2 blessed souls who feel the path towards a preferred alternative future is crystal clear. Consider yourself most fortunate. Thank you so much for sharing those results. So what I'll share with you in the subsequent slides is, of course, just one humble submission for how one might conceive of structuring such a recovery plan. It's not a financial plan that I'm presenting, of course. We're futurists, qualitative futurists as that. It is a conceptual framework, really, to think about how you may conceive of your recovery plan. Thanks so much for sharing your views. I'm going to stop the share results there, Christelle. Thanks very much for that poll. Okay, so if we work then within that kind of really broad conceptual landscape, of course, we're thinking of this in a sort of organizational theory context. Then many of you know that my favorite poet is Robert Frost, an American poet from the 1940s. And in fact, in my book, I quote Robert Frost at the start of every chapter. And so let me continue that tradition here. Robert Frost, the American poet, says it like this. He says, I advocate a semi-revolution. Interesting idea, because of course in times of crisis we're keen to cause an entire revolution. But Frost says, I advocate a semi-revolution. The trouble, he says, with a total revolution, ask any reputable Rosicrucian, is that it brings the same class up on top. So he's poking fun at the idea of a revolution. If our own African revolutionaries are in the room, they may want to respond. But he says the problem with a total revolution is you end up where you started. Executives of skillful execution will therefore plan to go halfway and stop. Yes, revolutions are the only salves, but they're the one thing that should be done by halves. So Frost warns us against the idea of planning to reinvent yourself and actually ending up where you started in the first place. That's why I draw on his poetic wisdom in the design of the model I'll share with you. So if we look at the use, if you just look at Google Analytics, for example, you look at the use of the concept of resilience from the Latin resilire, you can see that after the Second World War, roughly the 1960s, 70s or so, you can see what I've argued in the last 50 years, this dramatic need for recovery as we've been experiencing this white water. You can just see the timeline there, and you can see, after 2010, that upward tick. We have one or two people with their mics not quite on mute. If you wouldn't mind, thank you. So you can see that there's clearly in the last few decades been this kind of focus, this emphasis on the idea of resilience, and that's just to underline the idea that we really are in white water territory here. But if you think then about this recovery in relation to performance and time, then here really is a big part of my major argument. There was a time before COVID when your organization or your country, Ghana or South Africa, we have some guests also from Europe, where your country was operating, your organization, you yourself in your career, were operating in a sort of range of acceptability at a kind of pre-COVID level. And for some, of course, it was more acceptable than for others. Well, then COVID hit. And the results, perhaps in terms of the sovereign or personal or organizational performance, perhaps over the last 12 to 15 months or so, may have taken a little bit of a dip. Well, the big question is, as you conceive of the recovery from today onwards, do you really want to go back to pre-COVID levels? Now, perhaps in financial terms, that may be quite attractive. But it turns out that our relationship with the past isn't always a very healthy thing. We tend to romanticize things a little bit. That's why we have in English the idea of the good old days, when in fact, the reality of the past may be that the old days were perhaps not quite as good as we thought. If you think in terms of some developing economies, for example, in South Africa, the world's most unequal society, before COVID, why would that be something that you'd like to go back to? If your organization wasn't particularly strategically competitive before COVID, why is that a normal to which you would like to return? If the world was vastly unequal then, what's the attractiveness? If we were disrespectful to the ecosystem before COVID, why should that be something that we aspire to return to? And therein lies the dilemma of resilience. The idea that despite the crisis I'm experiencing, I wish to bounce back to a level of performance I had before the crisis hit. But why return to a place that wasn't working in the first place? And is there an alternative? Is there an alternative? We'll see. One alternative response that I know many of you will be familiar with is a notion made famous by Nicholas Taleb in his work on anti-fragility. So Taleb was reflecting on what happens when an organism, any entity, is impacted by a threat or a crisis. What are the options for responding to that? And developed work around the notion of anti-fragility. That doesn't mean absolute resilience. It doesn't mean incredible robustness. It means something a little bit deeper and a little bit richer. So if we think about traditional resilience, then that looks something like this. There's some sort of movement, there's an impact, and temporarily that impact is observable. It's not necessarily pleasant, but what resilience does is that you bounce back after the impact that you've experienced. Not necessarily a bad thing, except that what you end up with after you've bounced back, at best, is something that resembled what you had before you started, and now you have a little bit of memory of having been crushed for a short while. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not, at the same time, not the most innovative response you can have. If you think about traditional fragility of a structure like that is impacted by something, then you get this kind of result. So fragility is not really an option either, because, as the story of Humpty Dumpty teaches us, all the king's men and all the king's horses will not be able to put that back together again. Of course, why they thought the horses could do anything, I don't know. But the point is, if you're terribly fragile, well, then anything that impacts you will have an almost devastating impact. That's not acceptable either. One of the very interesting ideas I like to think about is a Japanese notion in the world of innovation called shindogu. Shindogu, which is loosely translated and meaning in this particular innovation sense, something that is useless, a response that is useless. In other words, not necessarily useful, certainly not useless, but the question is, if your life is going along very nicely and something hits, can you somehow connect that hit with the life that you used to have and the way that life has to continue anyway? And one of my favorite examples of a shindogu, any of you who've ever had children will know that that is a severe hit to your peace of mind and your lovely uninterrupted life as you used to know it. Can you connect it with something else that you need to do anyway? And here is an example of shindogu, connecting the new disruption with what you have to do anyway as life continues. It's not particularly useful, but it's not entirely useless. It's perhaps useless. So one of the questions then is, can we match a recovery methodology with the kind of stress that we've experienced, both in terms of its quality, its impact, its severity? Can we be equally imaginative as we conceive of a recovery? And anti-fragility certainly provides one of those alternatives. So if you think about a knife sharpener as one sort of instrument of anti-fragility, as you connect the knife with the sharpener, both of them, in fact, get better. That's so very different from this example, in which it simply shatters and will never be the same again. In the example of anti-fragility, both of them, in fact, get better. As you inflict the knife sharpener upon the knife, in fact, gets sharper as a result of the impact, not weaker. And one interesting place to look for these kinds of models, as I pointed out, is in nature. And Wilson was one of the early contributors to this idea. It's this notion that if you think about if you think about the impact of the glass, if it is confronted by a crisis, and you compare that with what might happen to this plant. If I remove this leaf from this plant, it will not respond in the same way as the glass did. Nature, it turns out, has a different response, and that is certainly worth studying in something that you might call biophilia. And just again, if you're interested in how that has risen, what you can see is just after the rise of resilience in the 1970s or so, in the 1980s, you then see this enormous realization among humans. Turns out there is wisdom in nature. Can we use that wisdom as we try to conceive of a recovery model? How does the plant do it? Maybe there's wisdom there. Here's an example of how nature does it in an anti-fragile way. So if you take that bicep over there and you disrupt it, you bombard it with a barbell, then what you get is not in fact in the long term a destroyed bicep, but you get a bicep like that. That is in fact a photograph of my own bicep. I detect some cynicism in the audience that this may not be in fact an original photograph of my own bicep, and I can show you that your cynicism is well founded. So the result is not a shattering of the bicep, it is an improvement. In other words, nature responds in a very interesting way if it experiences a stress that is not utterly overwhelming. And it turns out we have been studying this idea for a long time, and it's particularly relevant as we think about the world of health, that we develop, in fact, a sense of immunity to crises. And there's one way of defining it, the ability of an organism, and by organism here, of course, you can see I'm using this metaphorically. I also mean an organization or your own financial well-being, for example. The ability of an organism to resist a particular infection or toxin, a threat, in other words, a disruption, by the action of specific antibodies or sensitized white blood cells. And of course, we're looking for this mythical thing at the moment in terms of our physiology. But as organizations, I think it's also an interesting idea to think, how can we make ourselves immune to the next threat? Because if you accept my thesis that both the frequency and severity of disruptions have increased and will continue to accelerate, well, perhaps immunity will become increasingly important in the future. And as you know, it is essential for academics to make reference to some obscure Greek at least once in every presentation. And here it is. Those of you in the medical field will be familiar with the idea of Mitral Dartism, named after this chap, Mithridates, who was terrified that he would be poisoned. And what he did was to self-administer a non-lethal amount of poison on a regular basis, and in such a way attempted to present an antidote to his physiological system. So just to make sure that you're with me in terms of the conceptual development of this model, I'm thinking about the way that organisms are impacted by threat or disruption, and I'm thinking about how the recovery model of that may be conceived of. And I'm using organisms like the human body, like nature, as a metaphor for the way that organizational resilience can move towards a more creative alternative, which I will shortly describe as prosilience. Okay, hope you're still with me. Lewin, I quoted before when I told you about how freeze is a natural reaction, and that's just a sort of bit of academic discipline to reference the notion that others have also tried to respond to similar questions. So Lewin talks about the idea of simply freezing during a crisis, managing the change, refreezing it, and then unfreezing when you have to change again. The reality is, of course, the world is a great deal more complex, as I may have illustrated, and any one of you who has children will know what I mean. The world gets suddenly very complex when you are confronted with the complexity characteristic of simultaneity. In other words, things happen at the same time. So we've just come out of the global financial crisis. And of course, now we have COVID. And both of these are apparently flourishing at the same time. And that's really what makes it very complex. Other authors have thought about the idea of a journey. Dante Alighieri, of course, in the 14th century, with his Divine Comedy, to think about the idea of the inferno, purgatory, and paradise to follow, a kind of recovery model almost. If you like, and there have been other examples, and I won't labor it. I quite like this example that Joseph Campbell described in the late 1940s of the hero's journey, in which he says the hero ventures forth, almost like an organization responding to COVID, into a supernatural wonder. We couldn't imagine just 2 years ago that we'd be entering this supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, including the forces of COVID. A decisive victory is won. Well, we're not quite there yet. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Will that happen in our case? Will we as an organization, as an individual, as a broad enterprise, as a government, as a society, be able to return having encountered these fabulous forces? And will we be able to bestow boons on our fellow man as a result? You can see I got a little bit carried away in my preparation here. Many of you will know the work of Beck. I think there's a similar idea there with his spiral dynamics. But my argument really is bolstered by this idea. If you think about the notion, what I've called the disruption satisfaction matrix there, I just wanted to make sure you can see the heading there. The disruption satisfaction matrix, as I've called it in the paper that was originally published by the Institute for Futures Research. I look at the level of negative disruption, because of course not all disruption has to be negative, the level of negative disruption and the level of satisfaction with the status quo ante. So if you look at what we've faced with COVID here, the level of negative disruption has been high, right? Absolutely significant, enormous, in fact. Some would say it's off the charts. An interesting question is, how satisfied were you with the status quo ante? In other words, how happy were you with things before COVID struck? Now, maybe comparatively speaking, you'd say, well, actually, I'd love to go back there. But were you really at that time satisfied with what life was like then? And my argument is that you can have a kind of resilience approach if the negative disruption isn't very high and, you know, your satisfaction with the way things were was very high. So only really in quadrant 4 would I say a traditional resilience approach is acceptable. Not too negatively disruptive, quite pleasant and acceptable before it hit. For all the others, I would say resilience, a bouncing back to the status quo ante, is not acceptable. Because even if the disruption wasn't that great, but you were unhappy with the previous status quo, why go back to it? If you were unhappy and the level of the negative disruption was high, well, that's an even greater incentive. Even if you were happy with it, but the negative disruption is so significant, well, then you know you'll never go back to it again. So in other words, I'm arguing that in the vast preponderance of scenarios, the traditional resilience model will in fact not present you with a viable alternative as you emerge from the recovery. So I wanted to present a model then that had a few values that offered a process towards a preferred future, reduce the complexity a little bit, deepen the understanding of biophilic models. A model that was directional, that could say, well, how about we go this way? That is, of course, holistic and systemic. And then very importantly, a model that is almost a kind of geolocation, something that says, where are we now? How are we doing in our own model? And then I think what I'll do, Christelle, is rather than pause now, I'm going to work my way through a kind of first round of the model, and then open the floor for discussion. Okay.
Sure, sure.
So let me get into the model proper then. Ultimately referred to then as the prosilience model. So what I'm trying to do is highlight a kind of process. It appears at first to be linear, but of course, as all complexity theorists know, there's no such thing as real linearity. But of course, in the real world, we present things as linear. And what I'm asking you to do is to think about your systems, think about your career, think about your financial status, think about your insurance business, think about your society. And my invitation to you is to think about the extent to which that system, whether it's your family or your sports team, if you look at what's going on with sports teams in the United Kingdom at the moment, or your society, if you look at what's going on with protests all around the world at the moment, or your business unit, or your whole enterprise, or even your industry as insurance, my invitation to you is to think about how well it has conceived of its recovery process, and whether a model like this could make any contribution in designing the organizational response process in your case. Some of our own clients are already using it. So let's make our way there. Again, if you're seeing the same screen as I am, you're perhaps not reading all of that at the top. But the argument here is that a sensible first reaction is to create a distance between yourself and the threat. And that means removing yourself from the problem, extracting it, creating some sort of barrier. And of course, a mask is the most obvious kind of barrier that we can conceive of. And, you know, in writing the paper, the first time I evaluated one national society and had the view that here, I think we all did pretty well. We created a distance between the threat and ourselves. But very early on, you realize that this may have to be more severe than initially thought, and it might include what we call in innovation terms, cannibalism. In other words, the idea that there may be parts of ourselves that we may have to sacrifice if we are going to survive this crisis. We may have to, if we have a leg trapped in the bear trap, may have to amputate some of our own limbs as an institution. Sorry for the gruesome and dramatic language here, but it illustrates the point. So that's the first thing. Can you separate yourself from the threat? And here I think many organizations have done fairly well. Send staff home, social distance, wear a mask, get on Zoom, create distance between yourself and the possible threat. But of course, that is no recovery model. That is just a knee-jerk reaction. That is just a very, very first reactive response to what we're dealing with here. At a next stage, one might conceive of the idea of conscious care, to pause for just a moment, to take a rest, to make sure that we are secure. Here, I am not convinced all organizations have really spent some time to think about the well-being of their staff. Of course, there's the physiological health and well-being, but of course, many of us are expecting that the psychological fallout from the crisis will be absolutely enormous, may have some very interesting implications for insurance in the medium to long term. Many organizations have not been willing to stop. That's perhaps in the capitalist nature. And why should they? Very little rest, as a lot of us feel almost over-Zoomed and over-teamed as we have one meeting after the other, and the working hours never seem to end. And the security seems to be under threat for many, both in terms of their assets, which may be interesting for insurance people, but also in terms of their careers for many, and even in terms of their families as they face enormous threat due to the coronavirus. A next step in the process then I'm arguing is what I've called a thermodynamic rebalance and reducing inflammation. You can see the sort of organismic recovery language that I've used there. What do I mean by that? This is about, when I say the thermodynamic rebalance, I mean the mood of the place. So if you look at whatever it is you're watching, as Al Jazeera or Bloomberg that I like, or Sky News or CNN, or whatever the, sort of the big network is that you follow, you will see that the thermodynamic balance in many societies has been disturbed enormously. And I would say, very few countries have succeeded in doing that. We've seen in countries here in Africa, how many have taken to the streets and have expressed their displeasure with how things are being managed. Can we reduce that inflammation? Can we calm the mood, if you want a little bit of psychological language around that? As a next step in the process then, can we start to give a bit of nourishment to the system? And here I start to introduce the language of pro rather than re. So pro-resilience rather than resilience, and instead of rehydration, pro-hydration, by which I mean, can we start working with this organism in a way that gives us a diagnosis, a very early prescription, make sure the thing is hydrated and give it some basic fuel. In many countries, we've had food packages, not just in Africa, but even in the United States, food packages as a basic form of kind of refueling the society. Of course, psychological refueling will need to occur also. Then moving beyond the organism itself, of course, we need to start thinking about resourcing the future in what I've called pro-resourcing. So rather than just look at the spreadsheet and think, well, how can I get back to levels pre-COVID in terms of resourcing? I now need to start thinking about resources based on the future I want rather than the past I used to have. This may have to include some experimental movement. Think about someone recovering from a severe car accident. Think about physiotherapy recovery. Some early experimental, safe experimental, careful movement, so that the prognosis for where this is going becomes ever clearer in order for me to be discerning about the resources I now allocate to this preferred future. A next step then, as you think about the patient recovering in hospital, is what you might call so not just regeneration to a previous state, but pro-generation. In other words, making a new future, not just rehabilitation towards a previous state of health, but prohabilitation towards a state of health in a future that we haven't seen. Repair, we could perhaps have said pro-pair, but the language isn't always convenient. And then instead of reconstruction, what I've called pro-construction, making the future instead of yearning for the past. As these wounds start to heal, we'll get to a process of what you might call, instead of resynthesis, I've dubbed pro-synthesis. In other words, putting together, synthesize, but doing so in a new order, a pro-synthesis that puts parts of the institution, parts of the family, parts of the sports team, parts of the religious organization, part of the government, part of the society, together, as Humpty Dumpty couldn't do, in a way that reflects the future that we want. Of course, in that process, things will start to coalesce, start to form together in new ways, and we'll perhaps get closer to some kind of new balance, some kind of homeostasis. We're almost done with the steps, and then I'll open it up. But just to move along, it's important, of course, that we should remember that there will be scarring. There will be scarring. I've argued in the media a little bit that, of course, the hermetic kind of lockdown that we had in some developing economies will have scarring for decades. And the lack of discernment on the lockdown, by which I'm not arguing it should have been opened, let's not fall into the either or trap, But the hermetic approach to the lockdown will have scarring for decades. There will be phantom limbs, there will be muscle memory, there will be post-traumatic stress disorder. In other words, this will not be over when we now have a new agreement with the manager that I can work from home 4 days a week. There will be scarring, and that scarring needs to be recognized. Can we move beyond that scarring then to make sure that we are preparing ourselves for the next time something like this hits? So not just prevention, because we won't be hit by the same thing, but prevention, a general agility to respond to these crises. And I wonder if I might challenge my insurance colleagues, whether models like these will not be required for new insurance policies, a preventative response from those seeking insurance, that they will be resilient, indeed prosilient towards future threats, that we can unlearn some of the habits that got us into this problem in the first place, and that we have early warning system developments that makes us more agile for when the next crisis hits. And finally, I've said one of the requirements is a Greek word in every presentation. There it is, autopoiesis. That's the idea of self-organization. As we move towards a new teleology, in other words, a new goal-orientedness and a new paradigm governs what we do. Of course, all of this is against a psychological background that may have caused enormous despair as many. Think about day wage earners. Think about how artists are struggling. Think about those who have so tragically been retrenched. Think about those who are hoping to move from education into the world of work and the psychological effects this may have. Is it possible to move from despair to a little bit of hope through innovative models like these, where we can indeed form new meaning? We're certainly not there in the crisis so far. That will ultimately lead to confidence so that we can overcome the original shock. Colleagues, I've shared an enormous amount of content with you, and you've been very indulgent in allowing me to do so. But Christelle, I think what we'll do at this juncture is to allow some opportunities for comments. People should be free to pose a question or two, or indeed to comment, and I'm particularly interested in this, to comment on where they think a model like this, if it is not this model, where some of the ideas of a model like this may in fact be relevant for their own organizational recovery process, and indeed for the world of insurance. I have a few thoughts, but I'd love to hear from the audience, Christelle. Let's see what's going on in the chat.
Thank you, Morne. Geraldine is also here. And I also believe the president of CIIG has managed to join us.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes,
Yeah.
he's now here. We had a few
Yes, I can
questions,
confirm
so
that finally I have been successful at joining, and I'm enjoying the pro-resourcing and the pro-generation and the pro-synthesis of Dr. Mostert. It's great. I'm learning a lot from you.
Thank you, Tabea. That's kind.
Fantastic. Very welcome. Thank you so much, Morne. Wow, that is quite an input from your side, and very humoristic as always, which we love.
It's so difficult over Zoom to use humor, you know.
I know, you get it.
Cool.
You get it right, especially on this topic. There are not many in the chat box, but I assume people sit with their questions, and we would like to invite people to maybe switch on your video and share your thoughts with us. This industry, the more I hear now Morne's input, the more I realize the immense impact in the industry, in this insurance industry, and also that not all countries and industries are on the same process. They're on different phases in the process. And some of us might get stuck in one of these processes. And how do we get ourselves unstuck to move on and get to this taking action to move on in the circle? Some of us might be here on the rest and secure stop, and we stay there. And what was also very fascinating for me is right initially your comment about never in history have we moved back to what has been. Never ever. I never really thought about that, because the the going back to the new, oh, to our normal, that seems to be the narrative going around.
Yeah.
But it's so untrue that it's just never going to happen. So
Yeah,
how
you're
do we
so right.
prove?
Yeah. Yeah, Priscilla, you're absolutely right. And for us as futurists, you know, it's not that we dismiss the past. We just say it's the one place you're never going to be again. So I think by hoping for some sort of return to normal, we're missing the innovation opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah. Any question? There's a comment from Martin.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah.
Geraldine,
So go
would you
ahead.
like to make?
Go ahead, Christelle.
Okay, Martin says, everything seems to revolve around finance. How do we survive without it?
Right. Martin, I mean, feel free to switch on your camera and talk to us. I'm assuming that you don't mean that my model revolves around finance, and that you mean that so much of the recovery thinking is around finance. I think if that's what you mean, I completely agree with you. That I think there's been so much focus on the spreadsheet, but we must remember that we had business before we had spreadsheets. And those businesses were run by things called humans, and increasingly by machines. So I think you raise a really interesting question about, even if we can get the finance right, will that actually mean a recovery? Now, I'm very hesitant to say what I'm about to say, but I'll do it anyway. I think if we just focus on high finance, by which I might mean the markets, then I fear that inequality will in fact be exacerbated. And that a human sense, a rethink of the role of the human in the future will be lost as we consider simply the market impact of COVID. And I don't mean by that people just have to be rescued from their plight. I mean a strategic approach that really thinks about, as we say at the Club of Rome, an emerging new civilization that emerges from this crisis. I think what we might find, and in fact there have already been examples here, of where the financial markets, the securities exchanges to be practical, in certain senses do very well, while at the same time poverty is escalating, unemployment is rising, inequality is increasing. So I think you raise an extremely important issue. And I think a kind of myopic approach to the spreadsheet may get us into even greater trouble if we don't consider the societal implications. Yeah, great observation.
Thank you for that. The next question also ties in sort of the question Morne, you mentioned earlier also South Africa being the most unequal society in the world. How does this impact on us? And I want to relate it to this question. Morne, can you please share, and this is from Kofi. Morne, can you please share with us what some of our colleagues in insurance companies have done in South Africa or anywhere in the world with this model, linking it back to that inequality, high inequality, and how this can take us forward?
Well, we've had a few approaches from financial services generally, from one insurance company specifically, and in the case of financial services, they were really trying to respond to the early observation of how do we look outside of the spreadsheet? How do we get away from the day-to-day, what's gone up, what's gone down, and how do we respond to that? In the case of the insurance company who approached us, they wanted a particular social reading of what's going on. And in fact, they looked at it particularly in terms of philanthropy. And the role that philanthropy might play in terms of things like a foundation, for example, a charitable foundation at an insurance company. And one of the reasons they did that was for branding purposes. I mean, it's easy to be cynical. It wasn't just for branding, of course, but it is this idea that insurance companies walked a very tight line at the beginning of the outbreak, and some of them still do, where, of course, they were all promising everyone who bothered to be insured that, you know, don't worry, if there's a problem, you'll be safe. We'll look after you. We'll care for you. We are your protection in times of trouble. Well, here we are. We're in the times of trouble. And some insurance companies said, oh, I don't know if you're covered for this. And so there was a real kind of cynicism that started developing towards some of those insurance companies that were, of course, protecting their shareholders in the view of some of the insured at the expense of those who have been funding those insurance companies. And so I'm giving you, you asked for a practical case, and there was one case of a company that came to us and wanted to think about the role that philanthropy might play. Now, it's interesting, in South Africa, we had a very interesting response right at when we went into lockdown on philanthropy that eventually led to what was called the Solidarity Fund. And in an attempt to fund the recovery process and some of those most vulnerable. And in fact, we had insurance companies who made significant contributions to that philanthropic fund. And so insurance companies, I think, played a really kind of a kind of dual role in the process. Some of them wanting to fund the recovery and play an active role, some of them running for the safety of their shareholders and placing those up front, and others trying to find a balance between these various interests.
Thank you. I'm looking for hands. I don't see any yet raised hands. Martin followed up with a comment on the tribal grouping in any community appears to be the strength of survival. And perhaps this also refers to that very, very large group in South Africa that is not in the context of insurance.
Yes.
That is not covered anywhere. And you mentioned the Solidarity Fund, South Africa example. Perhaps there are other countries with similar examples, but maybe you can comment on the tribal grouping and their role.
It's such a very interesting idea. In fact, if you take Martin's idea, there's a lot of evidence of his idea from the study of complex systems. If we look at ecosystems, for example, natural systems, then one sort of general rule of thumb is that the more integrated you are in a network in the ecosystem, the more resilient and sustainable you are. And the tribal idea is a really interesting one. I know in the last decade or so, it's come under a lot of criticism for its sort of exclusive nature, especially in terms of tribalism. But I don't think that's what Martin means here. The value of the tribe is something that also offers a safe space. And in fact, if you look at one of the trends in the last decade or so in marketing, then building a tribe as a membership to your brand has been an explicit approach by many marketing specialists. And I wonder, and insurance companies have, in a way, tried to do that. You know, 30 years ago, branding wasn't all that relevant in insurance. I mean, there were exceptions, obviously. But now the kind of brand you have as an insurance company does attract a certain kind of clientele. And in that way, many insurance companies are in fact building clans, building tribes, building a kind of fan base almost, if you like. And I think the question has some significant implications for, for the social consequence of operating in bubbles, which in fact is the UK word for the way that they're socially distancing various groups. And of course, the bubble, is very useful for a physical distancing. But one of the risks of the bubble is that, in fact, your interaction, your engagement with others who are not like you, others who are not from your tribe, are in fact now people that you never interact with. It's almost a disincentive to interact with people that you don't know. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I do think that has some risk for the tribalism that in fact we were all trying to fight before COVID.
And it's quite counter to what we want to achieve.
Indeed.
With open. Maybe I can hand over to Geraldine if you want to have some comments, or the president.
Yes. Okay. So I would invite the president in to maybe chip in a word. But before then, I think once again I've learned one or two things, and I have formed my own word, Dr. Mostert. And my word that I'm taking away is pro-chindogu. Yes.
Very good.
I think, yes, we have to, as the Chindogu goes, useless, and you have to be pro in that regard. But then I would invite Mr. Terry Ahmed, if you have anything to say, and then if anybody has any question, contribution to add, we'll be grateful to receive them. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Vice Dr. Geraldine and Dr. Mostert for such a great presentation. I think you've given us a lot to chew on. In fact, you have set us up for a journey of resilience to resource ourselves based on the future we seek to create, which will build the kind of confidence we require for the future. There's something I listened to one of your videos on and then you were looking at business or life generally from the perspective of saying, if it's 100%, how much of it were you going to commit to the past? How much of it are you going to commit to the present? And how much are you going to commit to the future? And I'm going to say this. So when I listened to you, said 20% in the past, 30% in the present, and 50% in the future. And I think that if you can look into the future with 50%, then it means that you've got to be resilient. And the resilient process that you shared with us actually then enables us to build a kind of confidence about our pro-resourcing in order to be able to have confidence to face the future. I particularly enjoyed your slide on the disruption satisfaction metrics as well. But I mean, ending my comments, I cannot thank you enough for this presentation. And as you may know, the CIG is a professional body, and one of our strategic aspirations is to strengthen the continuous professional development of members so that we can improve our professional insurance practice and build future fit capabilities. So just imagine how closely related the topic and our aspiration of building future fit capabilities tie in so well. And as you know, insurance is a risk transfer mechanism. So in a time in which we are, where you are faced with a risk of such scale, and you never know when it's going to end, you never know when another such risk is going to emerge globally. It means we obviously have to be resilient to position ourselves in order to be able to do business around the risk that we see. And the only way to do it is, as you suggested, to be able to be resilient. And that way, I think we can make business out of the risk of insurance, no matter the uncertainty coming in the future. So I think you've given us a lot to chew on. And thank you so very much to you and the University of Stellenbosch Business School alumni community.
Very kind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tavia. Maybe ask if there are anybody else that would like to share some comments or thoughts.
And Crystal, just to say thank you to Elisa. Elisa is a chairperson for the ESCO, Alumni ESCO. Thank you for being here, Elisa. I really appreciate that. I saw you in the participants list.
Yes, she is here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else with some comments before Morne, I think you still have some slides that you wish to finish to do. Anthony?
No, I think this is a natural a natural kind of conclusion. Perhaps what I can say is that in the chat, if I could perhaps just do it to everyone, I'll leave a link for those who are interested to read a little bit more. In fact, it's an interview that I referred during the presentation, and it really does give a kind of step-by-step guide. So, and it's not an academic; it's a highly accessible article, and you're very welcome to just click on the link and follow it through. It's on academia. If you're not a researcher, just click on not a researcher and you can download it for free. There's no cost involved. And I just want to say also, Christelle, I think it is a natural pause for us here in the process, and to say thank you to the CIIG and to Toia and to Geraldine and to the USB for spreading this important information. You know, we are in complex times, and I think that it requires us to think really long and hard, innovatively, about alternative models of recovering here. I think what's also important is that we try to think of this in terms of the fact that the recovery of Africa will not necessarily be the same as the recovery of the United States or of Europe.
Yeah.
And so the fact that what we're doing here, Christelle, is to have an African business school communicating a model to African colleagues and also those from outside of Africa, but also presenting a model that was born in Africa. I think there's something there about our own intellectual development, developing our own intellectual products for the continent that is important as Africa also recovers from this. In fact, many of you might know that at the Institute for Futures Research, we have a desk for African futures, and its only purpose is to investigate the future of the continent. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can also get in touch with Christelle or with me personally, and we can certainly share some information with you. But just to say thank you again to Toia, Geraldine, the other colleagues, to the CIIG and to USB for this fantastic opportunity. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Mostert. And on that note of the African college or African education,
Futures, yeah.
I think I've seen a few people leaving. I just want to chip in to say that this collaboration is not going to end today. It's not just for this webinar. We want it to stay. It's going to be a long-lasting collaboration. And because of that, we want to have just 10 minutes for us to give a brief information on the USB. I mean, in line with what the future studies you do, what USB Air does, and all that, so that we can have a better appreciation of this collaboration and what can be brought on board to make it work, so that in the future that we are looking at, we can have the resources, the knowledge, and the direction to forge ahead. So I would plead with members, please don't leave just for 10 minutes. We'll do the next stage and then we'll be out of here. Thank you so much for your participation and for the support. So Christelle, if we can quickly move to the next stage where we have the info session briefly. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine. Just from my side, thank you to Dr. Mostert, Mr. Ben-Ahmed, to yourself for initiating this. And we really appreciate the knowledge shared today and the opportunity to interact with IFR. As you say, we hope it's a long-lasting collaboration. Going forward, there might be other organizations present here that would like to engage with Morne on similar situations for their organizations. Please contact us. Our emails will be in the chat box. And also rather, I'll share that with you afterwards. We will share all the information with all participants. Thank you very much. I think we have quite the experts here with us that can share. At this moment, we will not be able to share an information session, as Geraldine has mentioned, but brief note to everybody who is interested in joining us for any academic program, for any business course at USB Ed. So both representatives from both USB and USB Ed is in the meeting. We have Henry Boyson from USB, who I will ask to just share some info on how to apply, when to apply, where to apply for USB. And then Jimmy Linsky, I hope he is already with us. Yeah. And then also we have Dr. Mariki van der Merwe of Global Natives, who's the agent of USB for Western East Africa. So maybe if I can start with you, Henry, to just share some ideas, and anybody can please engage now and ask if there's any question or anything you need to know more about USB. Henry?
Yes, so hi there, everybody. So my name is Henry. I am the client liaison support for the University of Stellenbosch Business School. So we've got a range of academic programs, which basically it ranges from a postgraduate diploma in financial planning to an MBA program to development finance to future studies as well as our MBA and business programs. As you can see there, just thank you, Christelle. So yeah, so we've got a postgraduate diploma in financial planning. We've got future studies. We've got that in the PG DIP, the MPhil and PhD. Development finance as well. We've got PG DIP, MPhil and PhD. We've got an MPhil in management coaching, postgraduate diploma in project management, a postgraduate diploma in leadership development, and then the business qualifications, which is the postgraduate diploma in business management and administration, the MBA, as well as the PhD in business management and administration. In terms of the application process, if you that are interested in studying at USB, at the moment the applications are closed. Well, we've just recently kicked off with our academic year, and that will open again in June. So June for the 2022 intake. We only have one intake a year. It's important to note, if you are interested in doing in business management and administration, that has a rolling intake. So depending on when you send through your application, you can still apply for the PhD in business management and administration. Later on in the year, we'll have some more in-depth information sessions where you can liaise with the brand ambassador, as well as the head of the departments for the various programs. But if you need to make contact with me and you just want to have some insight into how to get your application ready, you are more than welcome to just email me. At the bottom, it's henrys@usb.ac.za, or you can email us on usbcom@usb.ac.za. Alternatively, international dialing code would be for South Africa +27 21 918 4111. Yeah, I am available. You can call me anytime. I'll give you access to my WhatsApp as well. And yeah, if you just want to, just catch up and maybe just ask anything, or even if you need to speak to a head of department, maybe just wanting a little bit more information, more than welcome to contact me. I am available. Yeah, anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. For USB Ed, is Jimmy with us? I'm not sure if Jimmy is with us.
Mariki is here.
Yeah, but for it,
Oh, okay.
that is the contact details for USB executive development courses. And we will also share this with you afterwards.
And Crystal, let me chip in that we've started some of these courses in Ghana. Last year we had ethical leadership. We have 2 master classes, and a few also sign into the senior management development program and the management development program. So these are some of the courses. This year we are running leadership resilience, which has started. In fact, it's supposed to start today and somewhere later in the year. So these are some of the programs that are run. They are executive development programs for middle line managers, for senior executives, and the C-suites. So, I mean, it cuts across all levels of leadership. Yeah. These are the courses run at the USB, the University of Stellenbosch Business School, the Executive Development Wing. Thank you.
Right. Mariki, do you perhaps...
Did I hear Dr. Geraldine saying leadership resilience or leadership prosilience?
Yes. No, this one is resilience. Mariki,
you
have to change it. Mariki and Jimmy would have to change it to prosilience. Yeah. Yes.
Very good. Thank you.
I think is prosilience. I don't think resilience anymore.
So we'll change the topic.
Exactly. Dr. Mostert has changed our minds.
Yes.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Mariki, would you like to say anything?
Good morning.
On the applications.
Yeah, it's afternoon here already. So, what a great presentation to be part of. I'm representing USB. You will see in the chat box in West and East Africa. And it's our privilege to work with everyone that is interested in these areas. And I just want to reiterate what Dr. Geraldine said around the masterclass. Is that we have much more of an Africa approach now with USB 8. We really want to bring leaders from East Africa and West Africa and from Botswana, Southern Africa together. And as Dr. Geraldine said, she's the contact person for that in Ghana. And then for any MBA interested or development finance, please contact us. It's a privilege for us to work with USB.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariki, Geraldine, Henry. From the floor, is there anybody that would like to ask any questions to our reps who are here? Or even to Dr. Mostert still, or about insurance? Or make a comment? I think people are ready for lunch or afternoon tea or breakfast, wherever you are. Faris, thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I've been listening, and then I can say that this has been a very wonderful presentation. Truthfully, the USB can lead, in having an African model for recovery. You see, with insurance, I always compare it to planting a tree crop rather than a 3-month crop like maize or rice or so. The effect of the COVID, the disruption, it is going to come rather the potential for excessive impact is rather be ahead of us than we think we are in now. So, as Dr. Morne rightfully said, the recovery in other parts of the world may not be the same as it will be in Africa. And I have no doubt that USB can lead this drive to have a homemade solution. It must be done, and somebody must lead it. I'm only afraid that If you guys do not lead it, it will not be done. That's my only fear. And this has been very inspirational. Beyond the objective, I think I'm highly inspired that we need to think deep and long. Thank you very much, all of you, for this wonderful occasion. All of you organized and made this possible. May the good Lord bless you all. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Farid Katriki. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paris.
Yeah. If there is no other comment, I'd like to show my bow tie and have the final comments. Probably, if there is no other comments. Just to say thank you to Dr. Mostert and it's the University of Stellenbosch team and the alumni as well. And of course, my Vice President, Dr. Geraldine, who is beaming so well in video, I can see her here. And the committee as well. You know, we have the Education and Research Committee of the Chartered Insurances of Ghana, which is headed by Dr. Geraldine. And the gentleman I just heard speaking and making very profound comments on this lecture. And I'm talking about Mr. Farid Katriki. He's a member of that committee for the great job they've done in order to tackle a topic that is not, you know, very simple like that. You've got to get into your thinking caps and to begin to look into the future and begin to be pro-resilient and resource yourself ahead for the future. Because today, if we had thought that, or before now, if we had thought that there was going to be a disruption that was going to, in fact, disrupt our business continuity plans, nobody would have believed it. But COVID did it. You don't know what's coming next. But as insurance, we've got to be able to look more into the future and resource ourselves ahead of that time. And so I think this webinar has really positioning us to think more into the future and to prepare ourselves for it. And so thank you very much for this great presentation and to the team that organized us. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr.
Really appreciate your support and for allowing us to have this. Thank you.
Okay.
You're always welcome. Always welcome.
Thank you very much. And with those comments of the President, we would like to close the event then until we see each other next time. Final thank you to all participants, all friends of the USB, alumni, everyone. Thank you for sharing this morning with us with such fantastic input and comments and insights that you brought to this discussion and enriched it with. Thank you very much to all USB representatives as well who shared that critical information. And we'll see you next time.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.